You can't shut this down.
Watch the temperature.
Karen's bully son grabbed my daughter by the arm in the middle of the park, hard enough that she cried out and dropped her bike. And before I could even reach them, Karen Holloway, vice president of the Rivermark Bluffs HOA board, stepped directly in front of me with her clipboard raised like a badge and told me, with a tight smile and a colder voice, that I needed to calm down and stop making a scene. She said I was already in violation of community policy, that the incident was being handled internally, that I would receive formal notice by the end of the day, and that if I escalated the situation, she would make sure the consequences were significant, as if threatening a father while his child stood shaking 3 feet away was just another line item on her afternoon agenda. I looked past her at Emily, at the purple already blooming on her arm where Blake Holloway's fingers had been, and the world narrowed into a pressure so dense it felt like the air itself was pressing me backward, and that was when I said the one thing Karen was not prepared for. That fountain sits on a drain line I personally designed, and the camera your office is blocking still logs to a system I once audited. The shift in her face was small but unmistakable. The kind of micro-fracture you only notice when you've spent a lifetime studying what happens when structures are forced past their limits. My name is Daniel Mercer, a civil and structural engineer who moved into this neighborhood to protect the only family I have left. A widower raising a 9-year-old girl whose mother's ashes are buried beneath the oak tree 10 feet from where Karen's son decided he could put his hands on my child, and there was nothing in her bylaws or her clipboard that could rewrite that reality. If you've ever watched someone in power try to bury the truth while your child is standing right there shaking, you already know the kind of story this becomes. Stay with me, because this doesn't end with apologies. It ends with accountability. Karen began issuing threats about citations, fines, unauthorized alterations, park access restrictions, liens, and legal consequences, her voice rising just enough for the surrounding parents to hear without actually inviting witnesses. But I had already taken Emily's hand and told her we were leaving, and when Karen said we were not, I walked anyway. In the car, Emily whispered that her arm hurt, the words barely carrying above the sound of the engine, and the steering wheel felt slick in my hands as the neighborhood slid past in a blur of manicured hedges and false safety. At home, I iced her arm and took photos, the camera shutter sounding like the closing of a door that could never be reopened. And when I called community security, they told me the footage was under review, that the HOA would decide whether it could be released, and the first violation notice arrived on my phone before I even ended the call. I stepped onto the porch into the thick Texas heat where cicadas screamed like something breaking. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, and Rivermark Bluffs revealed itself for what it really was, a place that protected appearances while children paid the price. 2 more notices followed, the third threatening a lien, and I printed them all, stacked them on the kitchen counter, and felt the weight of the lie in my hands. Emily sat at the table watching the fountain through the window, the same fountain she and I had rebuilt stone by stone after her mother died, the same fountain that had become a promise of safety, and in that moment I felt something shift behind my eyes, the professional instinct that recognizes when a structure is hiding a fault line. By sunset, Karen's SUV rolled slowly past our house, her eyes locking on mine, and I did not look away. Inside, I opened my laptop, pulled up public maps, stormwater lines, and municipal permit records, and as the rage finally settled into something sharp and focused, the first inconsistency appeared. Nothing dramatic yet, just a missing reference and a date that did not align, but enough to tell me that the ground under that park did not remember the story Karen was telling. And neither did I, but the next morning, the story Karen wanted the world to believe was already being printed and posted, so I drove straight from my driveway to the Rivermark Bluffs HOA office, the sun still low. The bruise on Emily's arm burned into my mind like a warning sign I refused to ignore. The building sat at the edge of the neighborhood like a courthouse that had never earned the right to judge anyone, all glass and polished stone and quiet authority. And when I stepped inside, the air conditioning washed over me, along with the smell of fresh coffee and toner. The front desk clerk glanced up, recognized my face immediately, and her smile tightened. "I'm here about the incident in the park yesterday," I said, keeping my voice level, "and the 3 violation notices that followed it." She hesitated, fingers hovering above her keyboard. "Karen's in a meeting. I'll wait." The lobby was already half full. A couple arguing quietly over a landscaping fine. An older man holding a stack of papers thick enough to be a novel. A young mother with a toddler asleep on her shoulder, eyes rimmed red. clutching a notice identical in color and shape to the ones in my pocket. When she caught me looking, she gave a tired half nod like we were soldiers who'd never been formally introduced. Minutes passed. Then more. While I waited, I listened. The man with the papers muttered about a fence that had been approved 2 years earlier and suddenly wasn't. The couple whispered about daily fines for a shed that predated the HOA itself. The young mother finally shifted the toddler and sighed. "They say my dog's a danger," she murmured to no one, "but he's never even barked at anyone." That was the pattern revealing itself in real time, not on paper, not in policy, but in the voices of people being pressed from every side by the same invisible hand. When Karen finally emerged, she didn't look surprised to see me. She looked satisfied. "Mr. Mercer," she said, too brightly, "you're causing quite a disruption." I held up the notices. "Your office is issuing penalties before releasing evidence of an assault on a minor." Her smile thinned. "We handle matters internally." The young mother stepped closer, without realizing it. "They told me that too," she said softly. Karen shot her a look, sharp as glass. "This doesn't concern you." But it did. It concerned all of them. I asked again for the footage. Karen refused again, citing policy. I asked for the formal appeal process. She slid a packet across the desk, thick with deadlines, fees, and warnings. The kind of paperwork designed to exhaust people before they ever reached the bottom of the page. Behind me, the older man swore under his breath. The couple shook their heads. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing inward as if the building itself understood what was happening inside it. I signed nothing. "I'll be filing my response in writing," I said, and walked out before Karen could finish listing the consequences she'd already decided I deserved. Outside, the heat hit me like a wall. The sun had climbed high enough to bleach the edges of everything. I sat in my truck for a long moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, and let the scene replay in my mind, not the confrontation, but the faces of the people left standing behind me, each of them carrying their own version of the same burden. Back home, I spread the violation notices across the kitchen table, added the appeal packet Karen had shoved at me, and began building a timeline on a yellow legal pad, dates, references, signatures, cross-checking everything with the public records I'd started pulling the night before. The inconsistency I'd spotted was still there, small but stubborn, and when I layered it against the new material, it grew teeth. By mid-afternoon, my phone buzzed again. Another fine, different category, same threat. Emily came in from the living room, sat beside me, traced the edge of the bruise that had darkened overnight. "Are they going to make us leave?" she asked. I closed the folder and turned to her. "No." The word wasn't loud, but it carried everything I had left in me. As evening fell, I emailed my written response to the HOA, formal and restrained, then sent copies to the city's General Inquiry Office and the Community Security Company, documenting the refusal to release footage and the pattern of immediate retaliation. It wasn't an accusation yet, it was a record, and records, once they exist, have a way of changing the shape of things. After dinner, I sat on the back steps while Emily watered the plants she'd insisted on keeping alive no matter what else changed. Across the fence, two neighbors argued quietly about a warning taped to their door. The air smelled of cut grass and gasoline, and the kind of tension that settles over a place when people start realizing they aren't alone in the fight they thought was only theirs. I opened my laptop again, returned to the maps, the permits, the quiet language of systems that never lie even when people do, and kept working until the stars came out and the cicadas started their chorus. Knowing with absolute clarity that Karen's version of the story was already cracking and that this time it wasn't going to be me who broke, I closed my laptop, washed the coffee from my mug, and changed into a clean shirt because the Delaney's were hosting their annual backyard barbecue, and half the neighborhood would be there whether anyone wanted to face each other or not. Mark Delaney's house sat on the far side of Rivermark Bluffs, backing up to the green belt, where the cicadas gathered in clouds and the air always smelled faintly of cut cedar. The grill was already going when I arrived, smoke drifting over the fence lines, kids chasing each other through sprinklers, while the adults pretended this was a normal evening in a normal place. Emily stayed close to me, her bruise hidden under a long sleeve despite the heat, her fingers laced in mine as if she didn't fully trust the ground yet. Mark stood near the grill, spatula in one hand, a beer in the other, smiling at people as they passed, but the smile never reached his eyes. Every time someone mentioned the HOA, his shoulders tightened. When Karen's name came up, his jaw locked so hard I could almost hear it grind. He nodded, laughed when expected, then stared at the coals like they were spelling something only he could read. I took a plate and waited until the flow of people thinned. When I finally stepped beside him, he startled, the spatula clattering against the grill, grease flaring up in a brief hiss. He muttered an apology that wasn't for me and wiped his hand on a towel already soaked through. "How's Emily?" he asked, not meeting my eyes. "She's here," I said. "She's breathing. That's something." He swallowed, throat working. His gaze flicked toward the yard where Karen stood near the drinks table. Blake nowhere in sight. Mark's shoulders hunched as if bracing for impact that never came. We moved a few steps away from the grill, the music from someone's phone too loud, the laughter too sharp. Mark leaned against the fence and crossed his arms, uncrossed them, shoved his hands into his pockets, pulled them out again. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, then stilled, then started the whole thing over. It was the body of a man standing on a fault line. "They're talking about you," he said quietly. "I know." He nodded, eyes on the grass. "Karen says you're exaggerating, that you're using the incident to avoid fines." My chest tightened. "And you believe her?" He finally looked at me, and the conflict was all there, raw and unhidden. "I don't know what I believe anymore." We stood in that space while the party moved around us, the normal life of the neighborhood brushing past like nothing was wrong. Mark's leg bounced. He took a long drink, then another. His mouth opened, closed. He rubbed the back of his neck, fingers lingering like they were searching for the right words on his skin. "I'm the treasurer," he said, almost to himself. "If this blows up, it doesn't just hit Karen. It hits the whole board. The reserve funds, the insurance, everything. People could lose their homes." I followed his gaze to the kids running through the spray of the sprinklers, Emily among them now, laughing despite everything. "People already are," I said. His face twitched. He looked at the fence, at the trees, at the ground. "I keep telling myself it's not my place, that I'm just managing numbers. That policy is policy." He exhaled hard. His hands trembled. He pressed them flat against the fence to steady them. From the other side of the yard, Karen's laugh cut through the air, bright and careless. Mark flinched. "I saw the notices," he said. "The timing, the way they came down on you right after the park." He swallowed. "It's not right." That was all he could give me then. It was enough to tell me where the crack would open. Before I could answer, someone called Mark's name. He straightened too fast, nearly spilling his beer, and walked away with a smile that didn't belong to him. I watched him go, the way his shoulders slumped when he thought no one was looking, the way his head stayed down longer than necessary. As the sun slid lower and the cicadas grew louder, I found myself standing near the fire pit with a few neighbors, the conversation circling the same questions everyone was afraid to ask out loud. I didn't answer them yet. I didn't need to. The night was already doing that work for me. If you're following this, and you want to see how this actually ends, subscribe now and stay with me, because what's coming isn't just about my family. It's about exposing a system that only survives when good people look the other way. When the party finally wound down, Mark walked me to the gate. He hesitated, then nodded once, sharp and final, like he'd made a decision he didn't want, but knew he couldn't avoid. "Be careful," he said. "I will." He stood there as Emily and I walked away, and the image of Mark Delaney at his gate, shoulders knotted, followed me all the way home. So when the next morning came with the sound of tires crunching on gravel outside our house, I already knew Karen wasn't finished. I stepped onto the front lawn before the engine even shut off, the grass still wet with dew, the neighborhood quiet in that tense, waiting way that makes every movement feel louder than it should. The SUV door opened, and 2 HOA enforcement officers climbed out, clipboards in hand, reflective vests already on, the kind of official costume that turns ordinary people into tools. Karen Holloway followed them, sunglasses in place, mouth curved in something that might have passed for a smile if it hadn't been aimed directly at me. Emily stayed just inside the doorway behind the screen, watching with that careful stillness she'd learned far too quickly. "Inspection," Karen announced, as if she owned the word. "Multiple violations. We're documenting everything today." One of the officers avoided my eyes. The other gave a tight nod and started photographing the front fence, the mailbox, the potted plants, even the chalk marks Emily had drawn on the driveway the day before. The camera clicks came one after another, methodical, invasive, each one landing like a small accusation. I crossed my arms and waited. There was no point in interrupting. Karen thrived on reactions. She moved from item to item, calling out alleged violations for the record, her voice crisp, rehearsed, while the officers wrote and photographed and tagged things that had never been an issue before yesterday. She paused at the edge of the lawn, staring toward the park across the street, then looked back at me. "And we'll be scheduling a secondary inspection of the common areas you altered." "I didn't alter any common areas," I said. She tilted her head. "That fountain, the one you rebuilt." Her gaze flicked to Emily in the doorway and back again. The message was clear. By the time they finished, my front yard looked like a crime scene, flagged and documented, my property reduced to bullet points and timestamps. Karen handed me a fresh stack of notices, the paper warm from her hand, and turned away without another word. As the SUV rolled off, I stood there holding the pages, the morning sun already burning the dew from the grass, and felt the shape of the pressure she was applying, the steady tightening of a vice meant to force me into something small and manageable. I went inside, laid the notices on the kitchen table, and added them to the growing pile. Emily hovered near the counter. "Are we in trouble?" I knelt in front of her. "No, they are." She studied my face, then nodded, trusting me with a seriousness that hurt. After walking her to the bus stop, I returned home and spread everything out, old and new, and began cross-referencing the violation codes with the community guidelines and the city's publicly available regulations. Karen's language was precise, but it was also selective. She cited rules that no longer aligned with the city's adopted codes, referenced amendments that had been superseded, and used deadlines that only applied under specific conditions she never mentioned. By noon, my phone buzzed again. Another notice, then another. Different categories, same threat. Each one carefully designed to look independent while forming a pattern any professional eye could recognize. I stepped outside, paced the edge of the lawn where the inspection had taken place, and followed the line of the sidewalk toward the storm drain near the curb. The concrete around it was fractured in a way that had nothing to do with weather or age. The slope of the yard was off by a degree or two, subtle enough to miss unless you'd spent a lifetime reading surfaces like languages. I crouched, ran my fingers along the edge of the concrete, and felt the irregularity. The drainage line from the park ran beneath this stretch. I knew because I'd checked the maps the night before. The foundation stress made sense now. The missing reference in the permits, the date that didn't align. It wasn't just sloppy paperwork, it was something physical, something that could fail. A neighbor slowed her car as she passed, eyes lingering on the flag still stuck in my lawn. I straightened and gave her a small nod. She nodded back, a question in her eyes she didn't yet know how to ask. Back inside, I opened my laptop again, pulled the updated notices into the timeline I'd been building, and added what I'd observed on the ground. No documents from hidden places, no secret files, just what any qualified professional could see and verify in the open. By late afternoon, the picture was sharpening. Karen's escalation wasn't random. It was pressure applied at the exact moment I was closest to something she didn't want examined too closely. As the sun slid toward the rooftops, I closed the laptop and looked out at the park across the street, the fountain glinting in the light, Emily's laughter from yesterday echoing in my mind, and felt the resolve settle deeper. So the next morning I drove straight to the city planning department downtown, the kind of place where the air smells like old paper and coffee, and the truth waits in plain sight if you know how to ask for it. The lobby was crowded, contractors, homeowners, inspectors, all of us orbiting the same counters, and I took a number, sat, and reviewed the public stormwater maps on my tablet while the screen overhead ticked forward. Every inconsistency from the night before lined up with what I was seeing now, and when my number was called, I stepped to the counter and asked for the most recent inspection schedules for the Rivermark Bluffs drainage system and the permit history for modifications near the community park. The clerk frowned, tapped at her keyboard, and turned the monitor so I could see the entries myself. What I saw made my chest tighten. The dates were wrong. Inspections that should have occurred every 12 months were skipped, and the last recorded review predated the neighborhood's expansion by nearly 2 years. I asked for the inspector of record. She gave me a name I recognized from older municipal work, a man who retired before the listed inspection date. I thanked her, stepped aside, and pulled up the structural standards for that soil type. The clay content around Rivermark Bluffs required reinforced drainage support, and if that support had been altered without updated approval, the risk wasn't theoretical, it was measurable. I stood there running calculations in my head, the way you do when you can almost hear the material complaining. Outside, the heat hit me again. I walked the block, found a shaded bench, and called an old colleague from my engineering firm, someone who specialized in foundation failures. I described what I'd seen: the cracked concrete, the slope, the missing inspections. He went quiet for a moment, then told me I needed to treat this as a potential hazard, not an HOA dispute. By the time I drove home, my phone buzzed with another notice from Karen. This one accused me of interfering with an official inspection process. I laughed once, short and sharp, and parked in front of the house. Emily met me at the door, backpack slipping from one shoulder, the bruise on her arm fading from purple to yellow. "Did you fix it?" she asked. "I'm working on it," I said, and she nodded, trusting me the way kids do when they believe the world still makes sense. After she went to her room, I spread the new information across the table, printed the city records, highlighted the gaps, and began drafting a technical summary of what the inconsistencies could mean if the system had been altered without compliance. No accusations yet, just facts, measurements, consequences. That evening, I walked back toward the park, staying on the public sidewalk, and examined the drainage inlets, the concrete seams, the hairline fractures running where water had been forced through spaces never designed to carry it. I photographed everything in the open, time-stamped, geotagged, and uploaded the images to my working file. A neighbor paused while walking her dog. "They're saying you're a problem," she said. I met her eyes. "They're wrong." She nodded slowly, as if filing that away. When I returned home, I sat at the desk until the sky darkened, the cicadas rising again, and compiled the first version of my professional assessment, not to send yet, but to sharpen. This wasn't about catching Karen in a lie. It was about protecting a community that didn't know it was standing on something unstable. If you're following this, and you want to see how this unfolds when the professionals and authorities step in, hit subscribe now and stay with me, because the next phase is where the pressure becomes unavoidable. Near midnight, I closed the file, backed it up. I stepped onto the porch and stayed there for a long minute, the cicadas buzzing like a warning system that never shut off. The neighborhood quiet in the way it gets when too many people are pretending everything is fine. And when I finally went back inside, I packed my folder, my laptop, and the printed assessment, because there was no point circling the problem any longer. By morning, I was in the downtown conference room at Hawthorne and Pike Engineering, the long glass table reflecting the skyline, and my own face looking more tired than I felt. I'd asked for the meeting the night before, and 3 of the firm's senior engineers were already there when I arrived, men and women I'd worked with for years, the kind of professionals who don't dramatize anything but don't ignore warning signs either. I laid out the photographs, the city records, the inspection gaps, the measurements I'd taken from the sidewalk and curb, and walked them through the timeline Karen's office had forced on me. No speeches, no accusations, just facts stacked on facts. They studied everything in silence, flipping pages, leaning closer to the images of cracked concrete, murmuring numbers to each other under their breath. One of them, Sarah, tapped the table and drew a line through the air with her finger, following the path of the drainage system as if she could see it underground. Another, Lewis, pulled up soil reports from the region and cross-referenced them with the slope data I'd recorded. The third, Ron, sat back with his arms folded, eyes closed for a moment, then opened them and nodded once. "This isn't cosmetic," Sarah said. "If the support's been modified without reinforcement, you're looking at long-term structural stress, possibly sudden failure under heavy rain." Lewis added, "And if those inspections are fabricated or skipped, liability isn't just civil, it's regulatory." The room felt colder after that, the kind of cold that comes when a problem finally names itself. I asked them what the next step should be. Ron said, "You formalize your assessment and submit it, City Building Department, Public Works, and you notify the HOA's insurance carrier. If they're underwriting a risk they don't understand, they'll want to know." I nodded. That had already been forming in my mind. Hearing it out loud made it real. When the meeting ended, they promised to review my draft and add their professional concurrence where appropriate. As I gathered my things, Sarah caught my arm gently. "You're doing the right thing," she said. "This isn't about your dispute. This is about safety." The drive home felt shorter, the road steady under the tires. At the house, Emily was doing homework at the table, humming, the bruise on her arm now a pale shadow. I kissed the top of her head, told her I'd be in my office for a bit, and closed the door. I worked through the afternoon, tightening language, adding references, making sure every claim was supported by measurements and publicly available data, the kind of document that stands on its own, no matter who tries to tear it down. By early evening, the assessment was finished, 40 pages of technical clarity and potential consequences, and I sent it to Hawthorne and Pike for final review. My phone buzzed twice while I waited. Both messages from Karen. The first warned me about continued non-compliance. The second informed me that my appeal window was closing and that additional enforcement actions were pending. I didn't respond. After dinner, I walked Emily to the mailbox, with the sky streaked orange and purple, the park quiet across the street, the fountain whispering like it always did. She slipped her hand into mine. "Are we still safe?" she asked. "Yes," I said, and this time the word carried something new, something built on more than hope. When we got back, an email from Sarah was waiting. Their concurrence was attached, signed and dated. I added it to the file, encrypted the folder, and prepared the outgoing messages. I addressed the first to the City Building Department and Public Works, attaching the assessment and requesting immediate review. The second went to the HOA's insurance carrier, the policy number pulled from the association's own public disclosures, the subject line simple and precise. The third went to the community security company, documenting the refusal to release footage and the pattern of retaliation. Before hitting send, I paused, thinking of Mark at his fence, of the neighbors in the HOA lobby, of Emily's small voice in the car, and then I sent them all. By the time the confirmation receipts arrived, the sun was gone, the porch light flicked on automatically, and the cicadas had settled into their endless chorus. Karen still thought she controlled the story, but the story was no longer hers alone. And that truth followed me the next afternoon when I drove to the small cafe just outside the neighborhood, the one with the cracked blue sign and the tables too close together, the kind of place people choose when they want to talk without being seen. Mark Delaney was already there, sitting in the corner booth, his coffee untouched, his hands folded and unfolded so many times the paper napkin in front of him looked like it had survived a storm. He didn't look up when I arrived, just slid the napkin aside and rubbed his palms against his jeans, then finally lifted his eyes to mine. They were bloodshot, rimmed with something heavier than exhaustion. "I didn't sleep," he said. I sat, and the vinyl seat creaked too loudly in the quiet. Outside, a delivery truck hissed as it pulled away, the noise briefly covering the silence between us. Mark leaned forward, elbows on the table, then sat back again, as if he couldn't find a position that didn't hurt. "I heard from the insurance carrier this morning," he said. "They contacted the board, asked for documentation on the drainage modifications near the park." My chest tightened. And Karen told them everything was compliant. Same story she's been telling everyone. He swallowed. She asked me to back her up. I waited. The air smelled like burnt espresso and sugar. He shook his head. I couldn't. His hands started trembling. He pressed them together, then separated them again, as if testing whether they still belonged to him. "Do you remember the old gate on the east side of the park? The one they removed last year?" "Yes. That gate was my idea," he said. "My wife used to walk there every morning after her chemo treatments. She was too weak to go far, but that gate opened straight onto the greenbelt, and she loved the quiet. When Karen wanted it removed to improve flow, I fought her. She overruled me, said it was unnecessary, that maintenance costs were too high." His voice cracked. He stopped, stared at the table, then went on. "2 months later, my wife slipped near the drainage slope that replaced it. The ground was uneven. She fractured her hip. Complications followed. She never really recovered." The cafe noise faded around us, the clink of cups, the murmur of other conversations, all of it distant. "I've been carrying that," he said, "telling myself it was just bad luck, that the park changes weren't connected. But when I saw your assessment, the inspection gaps, the dates that don't line up, I knew." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded envelope, thick with papers. His fingers hovered for a second before he slid it across the table. "These are internal emails," he said. Karen instructing the maintenance contractor to bypass the city permit update, telling them she'd handle the paperwork. The falsified inspection reports. The budget reallocation to cover emergency repairs after the first drainage failure last fall. The one we never disclosed to the community. I didn't open the envelope yet. I watched him. "I'm the treasurer," he continued. I signed off on the budgets. I told myself I didn't know what the line items meant, that it wasn't my job to question operations. His jaw tightened. It was my job. He pushed the envelope closer. You need these. I finally took it, the weight of it heavier than paper. Are you sure? He nodded once, sharp. I'm done pretending. We sat there for a moment, the confession hanging between us. Outside, someone laughed too loudly, the sound wrong in the space we were in. If you're still with me in this, I said quietly, what happens next won't be easy. He looked up, eyes steady for the first time. Neither was watching my wife disappear. I tucked the envelope into my bag. Thank you. When we stood, he swayed slightly, then caught himself. At the door, he hesitated. Protect your daughter, he said. That's what this is really about. I nodded. For both of us. I drove home with the envelope beside me, the sky low and heavy over Rivermark Bluffs, the fountain visible across the street when I pulled in, water catching the last light. Emily was on the porch, drawing with chalk again, the bruise on her arm almost gone, but the memory still there in both of us. I went inside, set the envelope on my desk, and opened it carefully. Mark hadn't exaggerated. The trail was clean, undeniable, a record of choices that had already cost one family everything and nearly cost another. The story had shifted, not because of paper alone, but because of the people behind it, and with Mark's envelope in my bag and my assessment ready, I found myself the next morning standing once again inside the city planning department lobby, the wide marble floor echoing with footsteps, the smell of printer toner and burnt coffee hanging in the air, as though the building itself had been running on nothing but stress and deadlines for decades. I checked in at the counter and waited, the envelope heavy at my side, my mind replaying Mark's voice, the gate, his wife, the quiet cruelty of decisions that looked harmless on a spreadsheet, but rewrote lives. A municipal engineer finally waved me through, a woman with gray streaks in her hair and eyes that had seen enough broken foundations to distrust any easy explanation. We sat at a round table near the windows, where sunlight washed the surface in pale gold. I laid out my assessment, the concurrence from Hawthorne and Pike, and then the envelope Mark had given me. I told her I wanted everything on record, formally submitted, with an immediate request for field review and inspection scheduling. She listened without interrupting, flipping page after page, the way professionals do when they already know a storm is coming, and they're measuring how hard the wind will hit. When she reached the emails, her mouth tightened. She turned one screen toward me, then another, cross-checking dates and names, the pieces aligning in real time. This is serious, she said quietly. If this is accurate, the neighborhood's drainage modifications could be non-compliant on multiple levels. I believe it is, I said, and I believe the community is at risk. She nodded and stood, carrying the stack of documents toward a back office. Through the glass wall, I could see her conferring with another official, then another. Phones came out. Notes were scribbled. I waited, hands folded, the hum of the building filling the space where my thoughts tried to spiral. When she returned, her voice was steady. We're initiating an official inquiry. Field inspectors will be assigned. We'll also notify Public Works and coordinate with the Insurance Oversight Office. You should expect contact. I felt the weight in my chest shift, not gone, but redistributed, like a structure finding a new balance. Before leaving, I stepped into the public records area and filed a written summary of the submission, making sure everything was logged under both my name and the Rivermark Bluffs HOA. Transparency matters when the ground is moving. Outside, the sun was already high, the city loud with traffic and construction. I leaned against the wall for a moment, breathing, then pulled out my phone and drafted a brief update to the neighbors who had spoken to me in the lobby days earlier, not with accusations, just with facts and the assurance that the city was now involved. If you want to see how this fight actually unfolds when real institutions start paying attention, tap the subscribe button and stay with me, because this is where the pressure turns permanent. The drive back toward the neighborhood felt different. I wasn't alone in this anymore. At home, Emily ran out to meet me, chalk dust on her hands, a smile breaking through the careful seriousness she'd carried since the park. I knelt and hugged her, the smell of sunscreen and grass grounding me. Inside, I scanned the documents and stored the originals in my working case file, then began mapping the next phase, who needed to be informed, how the sequence would unfold once inspectors stepped onto the site, how Karen's narrative would collapse under the weight of verifiable fact. By afternoon, messages started coming in. One neighbor asking if the city really had been contacted. Another saying the HOA had sent out a notice about routine infrastructure review. Karen's attempt to control the language was already visible, a preemptive shield. I walked to the edge of the yard and looked across at the park, the fountain steady in the light, children playing as if the ground beneath them weren't being quietly re-examined by people who understood what failure looked like. When evening fell, I sat at my desk and prepared the communication for the insurance carrier's oversight division, referencing the city submission and attaching the technical summary, every word measured, every claim anchored to something real. The responses wouldn't come immediately. Bureaucracy moves in its own time, but it does move, and once it does, it doesn't stop just because someone like Karen wants it to. That night, as the cicadas began again and Emily drifted to sleep, I stood at the window and let myself believe, for the first time since the park, that the story was bending in the right direction. And the next morning, I drove to the public library meeting room I had reserved under my own name, a neutral place with long tables, glass walls, and the kind of quiet that forces people to speak honestly. By 10 o'clock, the first neighbors arrived, the young mother from the HOA lobby, the older man with the fence dispute, the couple with the shed fines, a few others I recognized only from passing waves and uneasy looks. They took seats, some clutching their notices, others just folding their hands, waiting for me to explain why I had asked them here. I didn't accuse anyone of anything. I showed them the city's acknowledgement of my submission, the inspection request number, and the timeline I had built from their stories and the public records. I explained what non-compliant drainage meant in practical terms, not engineering jargon, but what it could do to foundations, to safety, to insurance, to all of us if it failed. The room stayed silent while they absorbed it. The young mother spoke first. Her voice shook as she described how Karen had ordered her to remove her dog after a single anonymous complaint, how her son cried when the kennel was loaded into the car because that dog slept beside his bed after his surgery last winter. The older man followed, his fence dispute tied to a property line he had shared with his brother for 30 years, a brother who had passed the month before, the fence being the last thing they had built together. The couple with the shed explained that it held their kayak and medical supplies for their daughter's asthma, and the fines had forced them to choose between medication and compliance. Each story landed like a weight on the table. I wrote everything down, not for the city, but for us, for the record we were creating together, the one Karen could not erase. When the meeting ended, no one rushed out. They stayed, talking quietly, exchanging numbers, realizing they weren't isolated cases, but a pattern. In the afternoon, I drove to my office at home and drafted formal affidavits for anyone willing to sign, statements of what they had experienced, dates, notices, impacts. I made clear they would go to the city and to the insurance oversight once inspections were scheduled. This was preparation, not spectacle. By early evening, my phone rang. Mark Delaney's name glowed on the screen. "They're panicking," he said. "Karen just called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow night. She's trying to get ahead of something. I can feel it." "Do they know about the city submission?" I asked. "She suspects," he said. "She keeps asking who you've talked to." I thanked him and hung up, the plan tightening in my mind, every piece moving into place. At dusk, I walked to the park, staying on the path, watching the way the water pooled near the fountain after a brief sprinkler cycle, the subtle but undeniable drift toward the cracked concrete I had measured days earlier. I photographed it again, the timestamp catching the fading light, the evidence building in layers. A neighbor paused beside me, the one who had nodded at the flags on my lawn. "They're sending letters," she said, "about the meeting, about unity." I smiled without humor. Unity comes after truth. At home, I organized the affidavits that had already returned to me, printed copies for the city file, and added the new photographs to my assessment. Everything was ready now for the next phase, the one that didn't depend on my voice, but on institutions that could not ignore what was in front of them. That night I slept lightly, the kind of sleep where the mind never fully powers down, and before dawn I was awake again, standing on the porch, the street empty, the park still, the fountain whispering in the distance. I thought of Emily's arm, of Mark's wife, of the gate that had been removed, of the stories in the library room, and I felt the weight of what we were about to trigger. This was the last quiet morning before the ground shifted for everyone involved, so I left the house before Emily woke and drove to the Rivermark Bluffs Administrative Complex, the larger building behind the small HOA office where records were stored, contractors met, and board members pretended they were running something more than a neighborhood. The parking lot was already half full when I arrived. Karen's SUV parked crooked across two spaces like it always was, a small but telling detail that matched everything else about her. I walked inside carrying my folder and laptop, nodded to the receptionist who looked at me with open suspicion, and took a seat near the conference wing where the emergency board meeting would begin in less than an hour. My phone vibrated in my pocket. A text from the city engineer confirmed field inspectors were en route and would arrive on site before noon. Another message from the insurance carrier's oversight office acknowledged receipt of my submission and requested additional supporting materials, which I sent immediately. The building hummed with quiet tension. Doors opening and closing, voices behind glass, the sense of something important moving just beyond reach. Mark Delaney appeared from the hallway, his tie loosened, jacket slung over his arm. He stopped when he saw me, his shoulders lifting and falling as if he'd been holding his breath. "They're locked in the small conference room," he said. "Karen's already furious. She keeps asking who contacted the city." I nodded. "It doesn't matter now." He glanced around and leaned closer. "They've been trying to vote through a resolution to restrict access to the park during maintenance. She wants to close it before inspectors arrive." "Can she?" He shook his head. "Not without a public notice period. She's ignoring it." We walked down the corridor together, past framed photos of past board presidents smiling beside plaques, all of it suddenly looking like a museum to a story that was about to end. I stopped at the double doors of the conference room and waited while Mark went inside. Raised voices followed him, muffled but sharp. 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed again. The city inspectors had arrived at the park. I stood, crossed the lobby, and stepped back outside into the heat, the sun glaring off the concrete. From the parking lot, I could see the park across the street. 2 city trucks already pulled up near the fountain, men in reflective vests walking the perimeter with clipboards and measuring tools. Neighbors were gathering at the edges, curiosity breaking through the usual caution. Karen burst out of the building, heels striking the pavement, phone pressed to her ear. She saw the trucks and froze. Her face drained of color. For a moment, she looked very small. I didn't approach her. I didn't need to. I stood where I was, the administrative complex behind me, the park ahead, the two worlds finally touching. She started pacing, barking orders into her phone, pointing at the inspectors as if her gestures could move them. Mark appeared in the doorway, watching her, his face tight with something between fear and relief. My phone rang. The city engineer again. "We've begun the preliminary assessment. We need immediate access to the maintenance records and any documentation related to recent modifications." "I'm at the administrative building now," I said. "The board is inside." "Good," she replied. "We're heading over." When the inspectors arrived, Karen tried to intercept them at the door, her voice rising, hands fluttering, insisting they lacked proper authorization. The lead inspector ignored her and asked for the board. Mark stepped forward and let them in. Inside the conference room, the atmosphere collapsed. Karen demanded explanations. The inspector laid out the request. I took a seat at the table, placed my folder in front of me, and waited. For the next hour, the story Karen had been telling unraveled under the weight of technical language, inspection schedules, missing records, and direct questions she could not answer. Each time she tried to deflect, the inspector turned to me, and I provided the data, the measurements, the public filings, the emails Mark had already forwarded. Mark's hands shook as he spoke, but he spoke. By the time the inspectors left with copies of everything, the room was silent. Karen stared at the table. No one met her eyes. Outside, neighbors were still gathered near the park, whispering, watching as inspectors marked sections of the ground and took photographs. The fountain continued its steady whisper, the same sound it had made the day Emily's world had cracked open. I walked out of the administrative complex and crossed the street toward the park, the heat shimmering around me, knowing the story had reached the point of no return, and by the time I reached the stone fountain, the crowd had already formed, neighbors lining the walkway, parents pulling their kids close, phones lifted, voices low and urgent like something breaking the surface of a quiet lake. The city inspectors had roped off part of the lawn with orange tape. Their equipment spread out around the fountain, measuring rods, tablets, cameras. Everything Karen had insisted for weeks did not matter, now displayed in full view. A police cruiser rolled up and parked at the curb, not for me, not yet for Karen, but for the situation that was growing too large to ignore. Karen pushed through the crowd, her face set in a smile that no longer fooled anyone. She stopped when she saw me standing near the fountain with Mark beside me, the water whispering between us, the same sound it had made the moment Blake grabbed Emily's arm. "This is completely unnecessary," Karen announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is internal HOA business." A woman near the front, the one whose dog had been taken, shook her head. "My son cried for 2 weeks after you forced us to give him away," she said. "You said we had no choice." The older man with the fence stepped forward. "That fence was the last thing my brother and I built before he died," he said. "You find me every day until I tore it down." A couple I recognized from the library meeting stood together. "Our shed held our daughter's asthma medication and medical equipment," the woman said. "We had to move it because of your citations." The voices layered, one after another, stories colliding into something that finally sounded like the truth. Karen turned on Mark. "You're supposed to support this board," she snapped. Mark's hands shook, but he didn't step back. "I'm supposed to protect this community," he said, and I didn't. She looked at me then, her eyes sharp with anger and something else, something close to fear. "You think you've won something?" she asked. I didn't answer her. I turned as the lead inspector stepped forward, clearing his throat, his voice carrying across the park. "We have identified multiple irregularities in the stormwater system beneath this park," he said. "Several modifications appear to have been performed without proper permits or inspection. Until further notice, this area is restricted." The crowd stirred. Karen opened her mouth, but the inspector continued. "We will be conducting a full structural review of the surrounding properties and the drainage network. The HOA will be required to provide complete maintenance and inspection records." Karen's face went pale. A woman in the back called out, "What about the assault?" The words cut through everything. I stepped forward then, my chest tight, Emily's bruise flashing in my mind. "Her son grabbed my daughter here," I said, "in front of witnesses, and the footage was withheld." A murmur swept through the crowd. The police officer shifted, hand resting near his belt. Karen shook her head. "That's not what happened." The young mother raised her phone. "It is," she said. "We saw it." Another voice joined hers, then another. The officer stepped closer. "Ma'am, we'll need to review that footage." Karen looked around, the weight of the crowd pressing in, her authority evaporating under the eyes of the people she had controlled for years. For the first time, she had nowhere to stand where the story still belonged to her. Mark reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling as he unlocked it. "I've already sent the emails," he said. "The ones where you instructed contractors to bypass permits. The falsified inspection reports, the budget reallocation after the drainage failure." The crowd fell silent. Karen's mouth opened. No sound came out. The inspector took Mark's phone, scrolled, then nodded once. "We'll need those forwarded to our office." The police officer turned to Karen. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you to step over here." Around us, the park felt different, as if the ground itself had finally been named. The fountain whispered, steady and unafraid. Emily appeared at the edge of the crowd with a neighbor, her eyes finding mine. I moved toward her, knelt, and she wrapped her arms around my neck. The neighbors watched as Karen was guided away from the center of the gathering, her voice rising in protest, but the sound no longer mattered. The crowd didn't cheer, they didn't shout, they stood there, absorbing what had just happened, the kind of moment that settles into a community's bones. I held my daughter and felt the air move again. And for the first time since the park, everything inside me finally slowed. The kind of slowing that doesn't come from exhaustion, but from knowing the worst part is over, and the rest is just the work of putting things back together. The crowd thinned as evening came, neighbors drifting home in quiet groups, the fountain still whispering, the police cruiser pulling away with Karen Holloway sitting rigid in the back seat, her authority reduced to the small space between her hands and her knees. The following week unfolded with the steadiness of real consequence. City inspectors returned with additional teams, marking fault lines, measuring slopes, drilling test cores near the drainage inlets, the orange tape spreading farther each day as more sections of the park were closed for safety. The HOA's insurance carrier sent a formal notice of suspension pending full compliance, a document that stripped the board of its last illusions. Contractors arrived to begin emergency reinforcement of the system beneath the park, and the sound of machinery became the new background of Rivermark Bluffs. Mark Delaney came to my house 2 nights after the confrontation, standing on the porch with his jacket folded over his arm, the exhaustion on his face finally easing. He told me Karen had been removed from the board by unanimous vote, that the remaining members were cooperating fully with the city, that the community's legal counsel was preparing to unwind every enforcement action she had issued in the last year. He also told me the district attorney's office had opened a case regarding the falsified inspection records and the suppression of the assault footage. She won't be able to hide from this, he said. I nodded, and for a moment we stood there listening to the hum of the neighborhood, the kind of quiet that comes after a storm. 2 weeks later, the police formally reopened the report regarding Blake. The security footage was finally released, and the witnesses who had stood silent before were now willing to speak. A protective order was issued for Emily and for 2 other children, whose parents came forward once they understood they were no longer alone. The park remained closed through the end of summer, but no one complained. Parents brought their kids to the temporary play area the city helped set up near the Greenbelt, and the fountain, once the center of everything, waited patiently behind the construction fencing, stones wrapped in protective covering, water stilled for now, but not forgotten. In early autumn, the city declared the drainage remediation complete. The park reopened on a Saturday morning under a pale blue sky, neighbors gathering as if for a ceremony none of us had planned, but all of us needed. The fountain was turned on again, water spilling over the stones Emily and I had set together, the sound carrying across the grass, the same and yet completely different. Emily ran to it with the other children, her laugh rising into the air, the bruise on her arm long gone, replaced by something stronger that lived behind her eyes now. I stood with Mark and the young mother whose dog had returned home after the HOA's orders were rescinded, the older man who rebuilt his fence with his brother's name carved into the post, the couple who moved their shed back and stocked it with their daughter's medication and the kayak she loved. Around us, Rivermark Bluffs felt like a place that finally belonged to the people who lived in it. Later that evening, I walked Emily home through the park, the light fading, the fountain whispering beside us. She slipped her hand into mine and squeezed. "It's safe again," she said. "Yes," I told her. "It is." We reached the oak where her mother's ashes rested, and I paused, letting the moment settle, the weight of everything we had carried finally lifting enough for me to breathe without effort. That night, as the stars came out and the cicadas returned to their chorus, I sat on the porch and watched the lights of the neighborhood, knowing the story had reached its end, not with noise or spectacle, but with the quiet, durable kind of justice that stays. If you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, hit subscribe right now, share your story in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from.